A School of Her Own by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 8. Joel Solves One Mystery. "You have another letter from your young man in Ann Arbor," Mrs. Williams informed me when I returned from school several days later. "Len put it on the table for you." She glanced at me. "He seems to be quite interested in you." I knew she meant Russ, not Len. "He's just a friend. There are a number of students from our class in Ann Arbor." I was flustered and annoyed with myself for showing it. After all, Russ didn't mean anything special to me. Why did everyone persist in thinking he did? It was becoming obvious by his letters, however, that Russ didn't share my views on the subject. I had told him that he was welcome to call at Thanksgiving time, and his reply left me feeling a bit uneasy. "I look forward to seeing you next month, and I hope we'll have time for a nice, long talk. I have something important to discuss with you. I don't think it's too soon to talk about our future. Do you?" I had already thought about my future, and as far as I was concerned, it didn't include Russ or any other young man, except as friends. I would need to think of some way to get this across to him when he came. I sighed as I put the letter down. Here was a situation I couldn't even talk over with Sarah Jane, as I already knew what her opinion would be. Of course I should encourage Russ's attention. Did I want to grow old going to school day after day? I pushed aside the nagging little problem and changed my clothes. There was time to grade some papers before supper. I spread my books on the desk and was absorbed in reading the day's compositions when Alice called to me. "Mabel, one of your pupils is here to see you." I went downstairs and found Elsie Matthews standing awkwardly by the table. "I forgot to hand in my paper, Miss O'Dell," she said. "I ran back to school with it, but you were gone." "Thank you, Elsie. It was good of you to bring it." I waited for her to leave, but she made no move toward the door. "Was there something else you needed?" Her eyes looked furtively around the room, and then she nodded. "I wanted to tell you that I saw Mr. Lawton going around the schoolhouse." I was startled, but I answered calmly. "Perhaps he was looking for Abe. Did he say anything to you?" Elsie shook her head. "No, he didn't see me." She hesitated again and then spoke. "I think Joel Gage knows where Abe is. You remember the day Julianne said he ran away?" I nodded. "Well, I saw Abe and Joel the night before, and I heard Abe say that Joel wasn't to tell or he'd be sorry." "Tell what?" I asked. Elsie shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't hear any more. The next day, Abe was gone." "Thank you for telling me, Elsie. Let's just keep it between us, shall we?" Elsie nodded, and I watched her cross the yard and start toward home. What an odd child she was, I thought. She saw most everything that went on, but what she thought about it, she kept to herself. I returned to my room, but the papers lay unnoticed on my desk. I may not have shown it before Elsie, but I was anything but calm about the news she had brought. I was particularly disturbed about Mr. Lawton's reappearance at the school. Abe had not yet returned to class, but it hadn't occurred to me that he had not come home, either. Did Mr. Lawton still think I knew where Abe was? I determined to leave the schoolhouse with the children each day and walk with them as far as possible. I would not give Mr. Lawton another chance to confront me alone. A sudden clap of thunder brought me to my feet, and I hurried to help Alice and Mrs. Williams close the windows. "Now it's a real downpour!" Mr. Williams exclaimed as he dripped into the kitchen. "We can surely use it." He glanced at the table. "Aren't we having supper tonight?" "It's only 4:30, John. You never believe there's any food unless the table's set, do you?" Mrs. Williams grumbled good-naturedly. "Get out of your wet things and sit a spell. It'll do you good to relax." It rained hard all night, and I dodged mud puddles on the way to school the next morning. "The little ones are going to be wet to their knees," I thought. "There's nothing they like better than a good puddle of rain." As soon as I entered the building, I spotted the water on the floor. "Oh, no!" I exclaimed with exasperation. "Don't tell me we have a leak in the roof." I ran to the corner where the pool of water stood and looked up at the ceiling. It didn't come in from the roof, I decided. It had come in the window. But how could that have happened? On closer inspection, the window proved to be open, just a crack. It was hardly enough to notice, but it had been enough for the rain to pound in. "Someone has been in here again," I declared in exasperation to the empty room. "I know I closed these windows last night." I looked around quickly, but nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Except for the wet floor, everything was the way I had left it the afternoon before. "Well," I thought, "I'm going to have to straighten this out, and I believe I'll start with Joel Gage." When the water had been mopped up, it was time for the bell to ring. The little ones, wet to the knees as I had predicted, slogged in and put their things away. It was too early for a fire in the stove, and I hoped they wouldn't catch their deaths of foolishness before they dried out. All the children were settled in their seats, ready to begin the day, when suddenly Abe walked in. He looked sullen and unhappy, but he sat down without a word. Joel ducked his head into his desk, pretending to look for something. No one else glanced up or acknowledged Abe's presence. "Good morning, Abe. I'm glad you're back." I'm sure I looked as surprised as I felt. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. He had nothing more to say, so I called the school together and had prayer. Because this was Friday, the opening exercises took longer than usual. In addition to the hymn and Bible reading, I called on the children to recite poems and scripture verses they had learned during the week. Nearly everyone had something to contribute, and it was almost an hour later when we got down to work. While the upper grades wrote their history test, the middle grades worked on times tables. To the tune of Yankee Doodle, we sang, 5 times 5 is 25, and 5 times 6 is 30. It was necessary to adjust the time of the music in some places, but the children loved to sing, and I felt they learned faster that way. Even the beginners sang along as they did their own lessons. When we had finished, Edward begged for some mental arithmetic. "All right," I said, "here's one for you. If Hannah brought 3 apples to school, and Ted brought 5 apples, and they each gave away 2, how many apples would they have left between them?" Edward closed his eyes tightly and scrunched his face up while he counted to himself. 4, he shouted. "They'd have 4. "That's right," I said. "Now, Hannah, can you do this one? What is the difference between twice 25 and twice 5 and 20? Hannah thought hard. "I'll have to write that down, Miss O'Dell," she said. "All right, put it on the board and we'll all help you." Hannah went to the board and wrote, "Twice 25 is 50. Then she turned and looked at me. "What next?" I prompted her. "What is twice 5? She wrote a 10. "You remember that the word and means plus. How much is 10 plus 20? 30, she replied. "Is that the answer?" "Not quite," I said. "The problem asked what is the difference between those two numbers. What do you do to get the difference?" "Subtract," Ted informed her. "Take the 30 away from the 50. 20, she said when she had finished. "Is that right now?" "Yes, indeed," I said. "You did very well. I think you could have done it even without your brother's help." I smiled at Ted, and he lowered his head, embarrassed. "It's time for recess now, so clear off your desks and get ready to go outside." "You may hand in your history papers," I told the older students. "Go out and enjoy the beautiful weather while we have it. And Joel, I'd like to see you before you leave, please." When the other children had gone out, I asked him, "Joel, can you tell me anything about someone coming into the school last night or before?" "I didn't break in, Miss O'Dell," he protested. "That wasn't what I asked you. Can you tell me anything about it?" Joel hung his head. "I'll get in trouble if I tell." "I'm afraid you'll be in trouble if you don't. We need to get to the bottom of this, Joel. I'd hate to go to your parents about it if we can settle it ourselves." Joel turned pale. Then he began. You know, Julianne said that Abe ran away Wednesday afternoon? Well, he came over to my place. He said his pa whipped him for something he didn't do, and I had to help him, or else." I nodded. I was sure that Abe was more bluster than anything, but Joel was sufficiently convinced to do what Abe demanded. He said I should pry open the door in the back so he could sleep in the schoolhouse that night, Joel continued. But he was in the woods when he saw Mr. Williams come down to investigate. That scared him, so he stayed where he was until I brought him some food in the morning. Joel hesitated, and I asked, "Have you told me everything?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. When you said we were going to the woods, I had to run and warn him. Then he told me I had to open a window for him before I left school yesterday. And that's all I know. I didn't even know he was coming back to school today." "All right, Joel," I said. "Thank you for being truthful. I'll take care of it now. Let's not say anything to the others, shall we? I'll not tell Abe that you said anything to me." "Oh, I won't tell anyone, Miss O'Dell. I won't say a word." I was sure he wouldn't. Joel didn't want any more conflict with Abe Lawton. I discussed all the things that had happened that week with Sarah Jane on Saturday as we picked up windfalls in the orchard and looked for early nuts. "I think you should tell someone about Mr. Lawton," she informed me. "He could be dangerous to your health." "I don't think so," I replied. "Abe is back home now, so there's no reason for his father to come to school. I just hope I never have a reason to keep Abe in." "You mean you'd make Abe stay after school, knowing that that man might come back?" Sarah Jane looked at me in amazement. "Of course," I said. "If it were necessary, I'm not going to let Mr. Lawton or any other parent tell me how to run my school." But I wasn't at all as brave as I sounded, and Sarah Jane knew it. "Ha!" she snorted. "I don't believe you'd keep him in for anything less than burning the schoolhouse down. If I were you, I'd ask Len to meet me after school and walk home with me." "You wouldn't if you had nosy little girls writing notes about you," I retorted. "Who knows how many people in the neighborhood are talking about me behind my back?" "You're not going to let anyone run your school, but you'll allow the town gossips to run your life? Is that it?" "You know better than that," I said. "Besides, Len has no interest in me. He knows that Russ is my—" I stopped. I hadn't intended to say anything like that. "You're what?" Sarah Jane demanded. "Are you keeping something from me?" "Don't be silly, Sarah Jane. You know better than that, too. I told you Russ was coming to see me at Thanksgiving time." Sarah Jane planted herself in front of me and looked me squarely in the eye. "You have never been able to deceive me in your whole life, Mabel O'Dell. What didn't you tell me?" "That Russ wants to talk about our future," I said lamely. Sarah Jane dropped to the ground and I sat down beside her. "This is serious, Mabel. I have the disturbing premonition that you are going to tell him there is no future. Why do I think that?" "Because it's probably true," I answered. "Oh, I don't know, Sarah Jane. I don't want to think about it." "Not thinking about it won't make it go away," she reminded me. "You could hardly find a better fellow anywhere. Unless," she added, eyeing me sharply, "you really are interested in Leonard Williams." I denied it vehemently, but something in the back of my mind told me that Sarah Jane saw me better than I saw myself. End of chapter 8.